She arrived with a mop. They arrived with money. But when the staff mocked the confused billionaire, the one they dismissed as just the maid became the only voice he trusted and the reason. Everything changed. The grand chandelier shimmered. Above the marble floors, as the hotel lobby buzzed with anticipation, employees straightened uniforms, checked earpieces, and adjusted their smiles as word spread today. They were expecting a billionaire. Not just any high-net-worth guest, but a Chinese magnate whose name alone brought prestige to any establishment he entered. Rumors swirled. Some said he might buy out the penthouse floor. Others whispered about the gifts he left behind at five-star resorts across Asia. The front desk polished the check-in counter to a mirror shine. The concierge rehearsed phrases in broken Mandarin, and upper management loitered just behind the desk, ready to pounce with courtesy and empty compliments. But when the front door slid open, their expectations collided hard with reality. There was no entourage, no luxury car, no translator, not even a single assistant in sight. Just one man, middle-aged expression calm, dragging his own suitcase. Behind him, and tapping his phone like he was trying to send a message, no one would read. He approached the counter and began to speak. His words were clear, deliberate, but spoken in a dialect none of the staff recognized. The front desk agent blinked, tilted her head politely, then looked over to the concierge for help. The concierge stepped in with awkward laughter and responded, in English, speaking slowly as if volume would bridge the language gap. The billionaire repeated himself, brows slightly furrowed, but his voice remained calm. The staff, increasingly uncomfortable, exchanged glances and attempted to mime gestures. But it was useless. The language barrier was not just inconvenient, it was unbridgeable. His accent was thick, but not unintelligible. Still, not one of them understood. None of them tried very hard. Behind the polished courtesy, the mood soured. The front desk manager stepped forward, pressing his lips into a tight smile, and gestured the man toward the waiting area. Another agent hissed under her breath, muttering about how these rich foreigners think money solves everything. Someone behind the desk snickered. None of them thought he'd understand their whispered insults. They were wrong. He noticed every smirk, every eye roll, stood silently for a moment, then tried to show something on his phone, a message. Typed in his dialect, a reservation code, something that clearly meant I have a right to be here. But the staff brushed it aside, treating him like a problem instead of a guest. He was finally handed a key card without a single word of welcome. No bellhop, no escort, no courtesy. Just a plastic key and a dismissive nod toward the elevator. Upstairs, the hallway was quiet. A maid stood behind a supply cart, quietly restocking fresh towels and miniature soaps. She had watched the entire scene unfold from a distance, unnoticed and ignored as always. But unlike the others, she hadn't just seen the confusion, she'd heard the words. Her eyes widened as she replayed them in her head. The dialect. It was familiar. So familiar, in fact, that she whispered one of the phrases under her breath. Just to be sure, language she had learned years ago for reasons no one in this building would ever bother to ask about. Her heart pounded. She hadn't spoken it in ages, not since before this job, before this city. But there was no doubt. She understood every word he had said. She didn't approach. She couldn't. That wasn't her place, not according to the rules written by people who didn't know her name. Maids didn't speak up at this hotel. They passed through hallways like shadows, seen only when something was dirty. But as she placed a towel on the rack, she heard the elevator chime. The billionaire stepped out, his face calm but unreadable. He paused for a moment, as if deciding which direction to go, and glanced down the hallway toward her. Their eyes met. She looked away quickly, returning to folding towels, trying to act as invisible as ever, but her mind was racing. Hot! She had watched men like him before, in other hotels, in other countries. Men with money, power, and silence wrapped around them like armor. But never one who had looked so isolated in the middle of so much wealth. She remembered the look in his eyes as the staff ignored him, frustrated. Yes, but something else too. A quiet disappointment. He had expected better. She wondered if it was the first time someone had looked right through him, assuming he didn't belong. Down in the lobby, laughter returned as soon as the billionaire was gone. The staff high-fived each other, mocking the man's speech patterns and fake accents when no one important was watching. They believed they had dodged a difficult guest. In reality, they had failed the moment they chose judgment over understanding upstairs. The maid placed the last towel neatly on the cart and quietly returned to her work. But in her mind, she wasn't folding linens anymore. She was listening to every word he'd said, every tone in his voice. She wasn't sure what she was going to do yet, but one thing was clear. If no one else in this hotel would help him, she would. Because sometimes the smallest voice is the only one that understands. The silence in the Billionaire's suite grew heavier by the hour. The lavish space, filled with modern art, luxury furnishings, and panoramic city views offered no comfort when the man inside couldn't communicate even his simplest needs. After settling in, he had tried to call room service to request tea, but was met with confusion. The person on the line repeated phrases in English, mispronounced and rushed, and when he tried to clarify in his own language, the line went silent. He called again. This time, he attempted to speak slower, more carefully, but the voice on the other end only grew more impatient before hanging up altogether. Frustrated, he turned to housekeeping, then to the front desk, repeating the same exhausting cycle of misunderstood requests and dead-end conversations. The hotel, praised in international reviews for its world-class service, was making him feel invisible. Desperate, he downloaded a translation app on his phone, typing in phrases carefully, then holding it up to staff members whenever one passed by. But the app couldn't distinguish between his dialect and standard Mandarin. Simple requests were translated into nonsense. When he asked for a humidifier, the translation came out as steam machine for throat crying. One staff member laughed directly in his face. Another simply nodded and walked away. Alone in a room, costing more per night than most people made in a month, he felt powerless, not because he lacked money, but because no one cared enough to understand. His patience began to unravel. He paced the suite, muttering under his breath, gesturing at the intercom as if he could pull meaning out of thin air. He knocked over a small side table by accident. Then, fed up, he banged loudly on the inside of the doorknob in anger, but in sheer helplessness, as if asking the walls to respond when people would not. The sound echoed down the hallway, sharp and unfamiliar, until it reached the ears of someone who had been silently cleaning the rooms nearby. The maid? She had spent the morning in her usual rhythm, wiping down counters, straightening beds, vacuuming floors, while being treated like she was invisible, but the banging startled her. She froze, her hands still clutching a cleaning cloth, and instinctively stepped closer to the door. A pause. Then another soft knock. She gently called out, asking if everything was all right. The door swung open, not aggressively, but fast enough to show how desperate the man inside felt. He stood there, eyes slightly widened, speaking rapidly in Chinese. His voice wasn't angry, it was exhausted. He explained everything in a few sharp sentences, words tumbling out as if they'd been bottled up since he checked in. And then, to his surprise, the maid responded not with confusion or awkward smiles, but in fluent, confident Chinese. She bowed slightly, her voice calm, acknowledging his frustration and apologizing for what he had endured. Just stared. Shock flickered across his face. Then his shoulders dropped, as if a weight had finally slipped off. He stepped aside, inviting her in. She didn't hesitate. She entered the room, the mess told its own story, opened welcome packages, untouched amenities, and a neatly arranged stack of notepads filled with handwritten Chinese instructions he had planned to show the staff. He explained how this hotel had been personally recommended to him by a colleague who praised its service and discretion. Yet since his arrival he had felt ignored, misunderstood, even mocked. He wasn't angry, he was deeply disappointed. He had been willing to overlook the miscommunications at first, but the growing indifference made him feel small. He was not a man used to feeling that way. She listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, offering short words of empathy. When he was done, she asked what he needed most. He mentioned a specific herbal tea, extra pillows of a certain firmness, and a room temperature setting he preferred for sleep. She memorized it all without writing anything down. Then, with a quiet promise to return shortly, she stepped out of the suite and disappeared down the hall. Within an hour, every request was fulfilled. The tea arrived exactly as described, the pillows matched his preference, and the thermostat was set just right. No one in management understood how it all happened so quickly, but the staff assumed someone from corporate must have stepped in. No one thought to ask the maid. Over the next day, the maid continued her duties in silence. But the billionaire began requesting her directly, first through hand gestures at the front desk, then by simply waiting for her in the hallway at cleaning hours, no longer used. The apper called the front desk. He'd wait until she was around, then speak to her calmly, trusting her to handle everything discreetly. She became his quiet liaison to a hotel that had otherwise failed him. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't want recognition or risk being accused of stepping out of line. Instead, she simply took his requests and quietly relayed them to the correct departments using careful English. Questioned, she simply said the guests seemed more comfortable with her presence. No one looked deeper. With each interaction, their conversations grew longer. He shared small stories from his life back home, nothing grand, just simple memories about food he missed or cities he planned to visit. She responded with her own thoughts, never revealing too much, but offering a kind of respect that wasn't rooted in status or salary. Came from very different worlds, yet neither made the other feel beneath or above. In a place built to impress the wealthy, she was the only one treating him like a person. For the first time since his arrival, the billionaire began to relax. He smiled more, spent time in the lounge, tipped generously, and took long walks around the city, returning each time with a quiet nod to the maid if she was nearby. The trust between them wasn't loud or showy. It was built in silence, in understanding, and the unspoken language of being seen when everyone else chooses to look away. Over the next 2 days, the rhythm of the hotel shifted, but only for one man and the maid he now trusted above anyone else. From the moment she stepped onto his floor, he would wait for her, greet her with quiet familiarity, and request her help with everything from deciphering room service menus to understanding complicated electronic controls in the suite. She never lingered longer than necessary and never made a show of their interactions, but he no longer relied on anyone else. Her presence had become essential. She translated requests, helped him fill out hotel forms, and even discreetly explained customs he wasn't familiar with. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't servitude. It was quiet cooperation built on mutual respect, forged in the shadows of a hotel that had misjudged them both. But the other staff started to notice. Whispers began among supervisors who saw her visiting the same room too often. Why does he keep calling for her? What exactly is she doing up there? It wasn't curiosity, it was suspicion. A young maid, unimportant and invisible, just days ago was suddenly being summoned more than the concierge. It didn't sit right with people who had built their careers on being indispensable to the hotel's elite guests. Soon the gossip turned ugly. Some suggested she was overstepping. Others muttered accusations of favoritism, or worse, assuming things that had no basis beyond their own jealousy. The turning point came when 2 managers pulled her aside into a quiet staff hallway. Their voices were low but sharp. They didn't ask, they accused. They told her she was spending too much time in one room, that it was raising concerns. One of them used the phrase, "Remember your position." Another added, "You're here to clean, not to entertain." She stood silently through the reprimand, not arguing, not defending herself. She didn't mention a word about interpreting, didn't reveal how much she'd helped. She just nodded, took the scolding, and returned to work as if nothing had happened. But inside, something had shifted. She knew exactly how this hotel viewed her: small, replaceable, voiceless. Later that afternoon, the billionaire made an unusual request. Through the maid, he asked the front desk to arrange a meeting with the hotel's director. The message was simple, but firm. He wanted to speak directly to leadership before his departure. Such meetings were rare and always meant one of 2 things: glowing praise or serious complaints. The director, impeccably dressed and always hungry for wealthy validation, arrived the next morning, flanked by senior staff. They gathered in the executive lounge, faces polished with expectation. The concierge was there, practicing a formal bow. The guest relations manager adjusted her tie 3 times. Everyone assumed they were about to be named and praised for their outstanding hospitality. The elevator dinged. The billionaire entered alone, calm and composed. Behind him, a few steps back, came the maid, head slightly bowed, still dressed in her modest uniform. The moment she entered, the air changed. Eyes darted. Confused glances were exchanged. Why was she here? Why had he brought her? The billionaire took his seat and looked across the polished conference table. Then, in fluent Mandarin, he addressed the room without waiting for a translator. Most of the executives stared blankly. The concierge tried to smile, pretending to understand. Only one person in the room moved quietly, stepping forward. She bowed slightly, then began translating every word into clear English. It was the maid. Her voice was calm but firm. She stood beside the billionaire and became his voice, delivering his precise message without hesitation. The staff sat frozen. It was the first time most of them had ever heard her speak more than a sentence. And now, she wasn't asking for cleaning supplies or taking instructions. She was commanding the room through language. He spoke in paragraphs. She matched his rhythm word for word. He spoke of his experience, of how he had felt completely isolated upon arrival, how none of his requests had been understood, and how the hotel, despite its reputation, had offered him no linguistic or cultural support. Then he paused and the entire room waited. In Mandarin, he gestured to the maid beside him and said something brief but powerful. She turned to the group. He says the only reason he remained at this hotel is because of her. Gasps were stifled. The room was stunned. The director blinked in disbelief. The billionaire continued, now with a quiet edge in his tone. He explained how he had taken careful notes of his experience, documenting every attempt at communication, every dismissive glance, every misstep. But despite it all, he had stayed. Not because of the concierge, not because of the amenities, but because one employee had chosen to listen. One maid had stepped outside her role, not to be recognized, but simply to help. He didn't care for the hierarchy. He cared about human decency, and she had delivered it. The silence in the room stretched long. The director's smile faltered. The managers looked down at their hands. The concierge shifted uncomfortably. Everyone realized the same thing at once, that the woman they had overlooked, missed, even reprimanded, had been the guest's lifeline. She had done what none of them could, made him feel seen. When the meeting ended, he thanked her in Mandarin, shook her hand, and walked out. She stood still for a moment, then returned quietly to her cleaning cart, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The atmosphere in the hotel shifted quietly but unmistakably after the meeting with the billionaire. Whispers turned into wide eyes. Staff who once ignored the maid began glancing at her with uncertainty, unsure whether to offer awkward apologies or remain silent. But she didn't change her pace. She still pushed her cleaning cart, still moved, with the same grace and focus, still spoke only when necessary. She wasn't seeking attention, but attention found her anyway. That afternoon, the billionaire requested an extension on his stay another week, maybe 2. He added only one condition, that she be officially assigned as his personal assistant. For the remainder of his time there, the request sent ripples through the management team. They scrambled, stumbling over policies, arguing behind closed doors about how to handle this. She had never been considered for any elevated role despite the fact that her resume, quietly filed years ago, showed fluency in multiple languages and international coursework she could never afford to complete. It was easier to keep her in uniform. But now, in front of one of their most powerful guests, they were caught unprepared. They rushed to approve a temporary internal transfer, naming it a guest-facing liaison support role to make it sound more official than it was. But she didn't care about the title. All she did was nod respectfully and get to work. With her now acting openly as his interpreter, his experience at the hotel transformed. His meals arrived exactly as he liked. His tours were guided with precision. He began making connections in the city with ease. He made it known in both private meetings and public compliments, that her presence was the reason for it all. He spoke to other guests in the lounge, casually praising her empathy, her language skills, her patience. He even noted loud enough for the lobby manager to hear that no luxury could replace genuine kindness. And no concierge, no matter how well-dressed, could outshine someone who led with humility. The staff began watching her more carefully, not with suspicion, but with quiet awe. She was still the same woman who polished mirrors and folded towels, but now people moved aside when she passed. Other maids looked at her with something deeper than admiration. It was hope. Because for the first time, someone who looked like them, who wore the same plain shoes, had shown the hotel what real excellence looked like. One evening, the billionaire made another unexpected request. He asked for a private dinner in one of the rooftop lounges, not just for himself, but for her and a few select staff members. Not the ones with titles or corner offices, but the ones who worked in the background. The night staff who restocked pantries, the janitor who repaired the boiler at midnight, the breakfast attendant who remembered dietary needs without being asked. None of them had ever been invited to a dinner like this. They arrived unsure, wearing their cleanest uniforms. Eyes wide at the white tablecloths and crystal glasses, she sat quietly beside them, trying not to shrink under the attention. But he made it clear he wasn't celebrating positions or performance. Scores, he was honoring humanity. He raised his glass and toasted not to luxury, but to dignity. He thanked her again, this time with others present, and called her his most trusted ally during his entire stay. No one spoke for a moment after that, and then slowly smiles broke out across the table. It was the kind of respect that couldn't be bought and earned. After that night, things moved fast. Word spread not just within the hotel, but to guests. As well, visitors began asking for her by name. Some wanted her help with translation. Others simply wanted to meet the woman they'd heard about from the rooftop dinner. The hotel couldn't ignore it anymore. They called her in for an official meeting and, in carefully worded praise, offered her a promotion. It came with a better title, more responsibilities, and a uniform she could choose herself. She accepted it with a quiet nod, then returned to her day without a single boast. It wasn't power she wanted, it was peace. On the morning of his departure, the billionaire prepared to leave. But before he checked out, he handed the front desk a sealed envelope with her name on it. Inside was a handwritten letter, short but deeply personal. He thanked her for changing his experience, for standing steady in a place that didn't always respect those who served it best. He wrote that if she ever wanted to pursue further education, language training, business school, or international studies, his foundation would sponsor her in full. No strings, no expectations. Just a gift, from one quiet force to another. She read the letter alone in the small break room, her hands trembling slightly as she folded the paper back into the envelope. She didn't cry. She didn't run to tell anyone. She simply placed the letter inside her locker, closed the door, and stood silently for a moment before returning to work. Later that afternoon, stood near the private exit as he was escorted toward his car, turned, saw her, and gave her one final bow, dramatic, just deeply respectful. As he stepped into the vehicle, he smiled and said, "Sometimes the most powerful voices are the quietest ones." Then he was gone. The hotel never treated maids the same way again. Quiet changes rippled through its policies and attitudes. Staff meetings now ended with stories of service that went beyond protocol. Promotions were reviewed with more honesty. And though not everything transformed overnight, one thing had become clear. Dignity had no uniform. It spoke through actions, echoed in quiet rooms, and sometimes wore the plainest shoes. Because one woman, who had every reason to stay silent, chose instead to listen, to speak when it mattered, and in doing so, reminded everyone what real power looked like.